her diary. Tonight, I thought my husband was acting weird. We had made plans to meet at a nice restaurant for dinner. I was shopping with my friend all day, so I thought he was upset at the fact that I was a little bit late. But he made no comment on it. Conversation wasn't flowing, so I suggested that we go somewhere quiet so we could talk. He agreed, but he didn't say anything. I asked him what was wrong. He said nothing. I asked him if it was my fault that he was upset. He said he wasn't upset, that it had nothing to do with me and not to worry about it. On the way home, I told him that I loved him. He smiled slightly and kept driving. I can't explain his behavior. I don't know why he didn't say, "I love you too." When we got home, I felt as if I had lost him completely, as if he wanted nothing to do with me anymore. He just sat there quietly and watched TV. He continued to seem distant and absent. Finally, with silence all around me, I decided to go to bed. About 15 minutes later, he came to bed, but I still felt that he was somewhere else. My life is a disaster. His diary on the same day. Motorcycle won't start. Don't know why. Friends, men and women are different. That's the first thing I want you to know. And if you haven't noticed that, you're either blind, in a comatose state, or you need to see your doctor right away so he can pronounce you dead. Men and women are different. And to which I say, vive la différence. Because it is our differences that draw us together, but there's also a warning because it's our differences that can drive us apart also. Marriage is like two magnets that can come together and draw them together, or turn the other way, it can drive them apart. And so also with marriage. Well, how different are we? Obviously, there are vast physiological differences between us, and you already know some of them. But others you might be completely surprised at. For instance, did you know that virtually every cell in a man's body has a chromosome makeup different than those of a woman's body? And we all know that women live longer than men by about 4 to 8 years or more. But did you know that a woman's metabolism is normally lower than that of a man? And obviously men and women are different in their skeletal structure, but did you know that generally a woman has a larger kidney, liver, stomach, and appendix than men, but smaller lungs? And women have a thyroid that's larger and more active, providing resistance against colds, and accounting for her smoother skin and her relatively hairless body and her subcutaneous tissue that's thicker. And a woman's blood contains more water and about 20% fewer red cells. On the average, a man possesses about 50% more brute strength than women, of which 40% of a man's body weight is muscle, and 23% of a woman's body is muscle. But looking at some of you guys today, I wonder if that's really true. But our differences are more than simply physiological. There's a neurological difference too, as Professor Regina Verman of the University of Pennsylvania put it. Men aren't from Mars, and women aren't from Venus. Their brains really are wired differently. By the way, it reminds me of a book that I read many years ago. It was a bestseller at the time. It was entitled Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus. Now, if you don't know the meaning of that, Mars is Latin for the god of war. And its equivalent in Greek is Ares. And Venus in Latin is Aphrodite in Greek, which represents the goddess of beauty and love. We're different. We really are. Which tells us that if you're going to get married, be prepared that you're going to marry an alien from another planet. Men are from Mars and women are from Venus. Now, about neurological differences, Dr. Willard Harley, in his book, His Needs and Her Needs, tells that when he taught a course on physiological psychology, he would provide each of his students with a brain to dissect. And some of them were given male brains and some of them were given female brains, because he wanted them to see neurologically how they were vastly different. They not only looked different, they functioned differently, and he wanted us to understand, not me, but he wanted his people to understand why women and men think differently. He said in his book, women have far more connections between the left brain and the right hemispheres. Then there are more connections in women between neurons as well, and there are more neurons in a woman. Are you ready for this? 12 billion more neurons. Which reminds me of the story about a man and a woman who visited a farmer's market. And they saw all kinds of booths of vegetables and vegetables and I prayed before this, Lord, if you want your messenger to stutter and be forgetful, it's okay. Vegetables and fruit, that's the word I was thinking of, and all kinds of meat. And then as they went along, they saw something that was very curious. They saw one stall that had brains in it, human brains. And there was one side that had men's brains, and there was another side that had women's brains. And the going price, a woman's brain, $20 a pound. A man's brain, $200 a pound. And the man said, Alice, it's just like I've always been saying. A man's brain is 100 times better. Is that the math, or is it 10 times better? 10 times better. We're 10 times more smart than men. And the man behind the booth laughed and he said, that has nothing to do with it. He said, you wouldn't believe how many men we had to kill to get a pound's worth of brains. Well, we're different, and yet we're equal. Seriously, men and women are dissimilar physiologically and neurologically, but equal and different. And again, I say, vive la différence. Well, if we begin by pointing out that in many ways men and women are different, the next question is this: what does the Bible say about all this? So we turn to the first of what scholars would call the text of primary reference. The text of primary reference is the first text in the Bible that introduces a new subject, because it's often vital. And so naturally I'm looking at Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2. And all of this points to the fact that we are created different by design. Let me say that again. We're different, created different by design. That's the second thing. So in Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, we read, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Note that men and women are made in the image of God, so that our sexuality is not just part of us, like having an appendix or a liver, but our sexuality defines us as human beings. And it touches on every aspect of our lives, the very core of our being, our psyche and soul. Now notice from this passage that a man himself is not in the image of God, and a woman herself is only the partial image of God. But only when we're together do we have the complete image of God, howbeit in a human way. So the Bible says God created man in his own image, male and female, he created him. And then further, in Genesis chapter 2, verse 18, God said, "It is not good for man to be alone." All you guys know that. But then he says that he will give them a helper, or a helpmate in older translations, which literally means a completer. And this word helper is a word that's given to God as a description. God is our help. And so this completer God gives us makes up for the things that we men cannot do for ourselves. And we're incomplete as human beings. But all you women already knew that. Then in Genesis chapter 2, verse 23, it goes on to say, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave," or joined together, "with his wife, and they shall become one flesh." So then, verse 25 informs us that in our pre-fallen state, our ancestors were naked and not ashamed. Now, did you get the process here, or the progression here? Number one, severance. He shall leave his father and mother. Permanence. He shall be joined to his wife. Unity. They shall be one flesh. And intimacy. They were naked and not ashamed. And can I say a word that only the mature of you will understand? That men and women were created to literally fit together. And then theologians over the years have noted that this physical union and the description in terms of intimacy and oneness and love is symbolic of our spiritual union of soul and mind and emotion. Well, if men and women are different and God created us different by design, then what else does the Bible tell us? Listen, we are called to relate to one another in different ways. So when you look with me now at the text we read earlier, please turn to your Bible, and it's in Ephesians chapter 5, verses 21 to 33. Ephesians chapter 5, verses 21 to 33. And if you haven't got a Bible or a electronic device that'll help you with that, look on with somebody else, because I want you to see this. And it's one of the most controversial texts in the Bible. Now, this is a passage of essential significance, since it's the longest passage in the entire New Testament that speaks directly about our relationship between men and women. So it must have something to say. Now, what usually happens when we open this text is our eyes are riveted on verse 22. Do you see it? Wives, submit to your husbands. And any further discussion on the roles of men and women stops right there. A verse, mind you, which has often been used, misused, and abused to the point that some men have given themselves permission through this verse to discriminate and to dominate and emotionally enslave their wives to the point of damage and destruction emotionally. Now, that's what verse 22 says, but look at verse 21 that happens just before that, and what do you see? It says, "Husbands and wives, submit one another in reverence to Christ." Submit one another in reverence to Christ. We're both to submit to each other. Now, sadly, in some English translations, there is a paragraph division between verse 21 and verse 22. Now, of course, the paragraph and the grammatical divisions aren't there in the inspired word as in the original. Somebody put them there. But if there is to be a paragraph division, I think it should come before verse 21. And starting with this text, submit to one another in reverence to God. And then what follows in verse 22, right down to verse 33, is a description or two illustrations of how men and women should submit themselves to God in reverence to Him. Submit themselves to each other in Him. So it's as if, in the first part, God is saying to the women, wives, here's what submission means to you, or placing your husband first. And then He immediately goes on in verse 25 to say to the husbands, this is what submission to your wife looks like for you. And what does it say in verse 25? Love your wife in the same way that Christ loves His church. How did Jesus love the church? He died for the church. And we're to love our wives that way. Reminds me of the old story about the husband and wife. The husband, every night before they went to sleep, whispered in her ear and said, I love you. I love you so much I would die in a heartbeat for you. And she said, you're always promising but never fulfilling. Well, seriously, when a man thinks about dying for his wife, laying down his life, he thinks of some unknown attacker which he fights off. Or he might imagine pushing his wife away because of an oncoming bus and courageously, heroically letting the bus hit him so that he's instant roadkill. That's the kind of image that comes to our mind. But the chances of anything like that actually happening are astronomically slim. So what must it mean? I think it means this. We're to die daily to ourselves, to put her first, just as we die daily to ourselves as we serve God, who is supreme. So husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He loves his wife. He loves himself. He loves his wife. He loves himself. For, in verse 29, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as the Lord does the church. Now, in the New International Version that you read earlier with me, it says that he feeds it, representing woman, and he cares for it. But a better translation, a more literal translation, is that he nourishes and cherishes. And I like that. And it's from this word, the nourisher, that we get in English, in older English, the word husbandman. And that means a gardener, a professional gardener, or a farmer. And coincidentally, or not, the English word for husband is a derivative of husbandman. And so as husbandman or husband, we're to nourish that she might flourish and that she might grow. Domination suppresses a person. Nourishing brings out the best of a person. So not only are men and women charged with the responsibility, men are charged with the responsibility of nourishing and cherishing their wives. But listen again to verses 5 and 29. And in the same translation I just said before, it says, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as the Lord does to the church. Men, you might say, I love my wife. I nurture my wife. But can you honestly say, I cherish my wife? Because that's what God calls us to do, and she deserves nothing less. And you see, for most men, we are wired to lead. If we don't lead and somebody usurps that, then we feel, can I say this, emotionally emasculated. But if we're wired, most of us as men, to lead, almost all women are hardwired to be cherished. And that's what husbands are called to do. Do you cherish your wife? And we can never give too much affection to our wife. That reminds me of the story of Myrtle and Herman. It's not a true story, but it's a good story. And poor old Myrtle, she was a saint of the congregation. And one day in church, she heard her pastor, Pastor Bob, I'm saying Pastor Bob because it wasn't me, but Pastor Bob confessed to his congregation that when he wants to show his wife how much he really loves her, he nibbles on her ear. And Myrtle went home. She was much intrigued by this. And she said, Herman, Pastor says that he nibbles on his wife's ear. And he said, what are you talking about? That's stupid. And he said, Pastor Bob says it. Why don't you ever nibble on my ear? Well, that's ridiculous. And there he was leaning into the TV. He said, can't you see that I'm watching the Blue Jays? And it's the last game in the World Series. This is an old story. And it's the 9th inning. And there's 2 out and the bases are loaded. And Jimmy Carter is coming to the bat. I don't have time for this. And she said, oh, Herman, just once, wouldn't you nibble my ear? He said, all right. Go to the refrigerator and get the glass with my false teeth in it. Seriously, we're to nurture and cherish our wives, and we can't give them too much affection. And yes, the scripture does say, wives, submit to your husbands. To say anything else would be to try and make the Bible say something that it doesn't. But in the same way, husbands are to submit to her as we submit to Christ. And so she's not to submit in blind obedience, but to follow in a relationship where there's mutual trust and love. And the bottom line is this: even though God calls us to relate to one another in different ways, the end result must always be the same. Verse 21, submit to one another out of reverence to Christ. Well, men and women are different, and God created us differently by design, and God calls us to relate to each other in different ways. Lastly, let me say to you that no matter what, God can make a difference in your life and in your relationship. This is the gospel. Change is possible. This is the gospel. Forgiveness is possible. Spiritual rebirth and spiritual renewal is possible. And reconciliation, which also implies rectifying the situation, is possible with God's help. And on the human level, there's also help too. Your pastor, or if you're a member of this church, I am willing to give you some help and counseling. It's not my job, it's my joy. And that's part of my relationship with you, and as my flock, God's flock, and as an under-shepherd. And if I'm not able to help, I have contacts with Christian, educated, and bona fide counselors, psychologists, and psychiatrists who can help you and have helped others in healing in relationships. Well, I want to tell you this. Everybody needs help once in a while. And it's no sin to ask for help. But it is a sin to need help and be too proud to ask for it. Thanks be to God.